Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're coming back to the series on blueprints for storming the castle. And today's video was inspired by a video that I saw by Agadmator, where he covered a game from the Women's Chess Championship, and Kashlinskaya played the King's Indian defense against Galliamova. And she showed that the King's Indian defense is actually a very powerful tool for attacking the castled king. And to be honest, I was very surprised to see this because it goes against a lot of my intuitions. For one thing, in the King's Indian defense, black fianchettos their bishop onto this diagonal, which is actually pointing at white's queenside. And yet, black is somehow able to mount a very strong attack against the kingside, against the kingside castle that white goes into. I found this extremely surprising. Also, it arises from a closed position in which the pawns are locked along the center. Usually, or at least the games we've looked at in this series previously in the Greek gift attack, they usually rely on a very open position in which the bishops are able to move quickly and efficiently to attack the king side. So it goes against a lot of my intuitions for how these attacks on the castled king go. And for that reason, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and see a few more examples of using the king's Indian defense to mount an attack on the castled king. So I'm going to start by covering the game that Agadmator also covered, except from the point of view of storming the castle, which is what we're concerned with in this series. And I'll also link to his coverage of that game in the description box below. I encourage you to check it out. He does an excellent job commentating chess games. And then I'm going to present a few more games that I researched on similar kinds of attacking ideas, executed in slightly different ways. So a game by Taimanov versus Najdorf from 1953, and a game by Donovan versus Fischer in 1956. It turns out that Bobby Fischer was an avid player of the King's Indian defense. He played it almost from his very first tournaments and throughout his entire career. And he left us some beautiful chess. So with that said, we're going to start with this game from the Women's Chess Championship between Galliamova and Kashlinskaya. The move order that we're going to see here is not the typical move order that you see in the King's Indian defense, but it transposes into it quite nicely. So Galliamova starts with knight f3, and the response is knight f6, c4, g6, d4. And as you can see here, this position starts to look like a Queen's Gambit position. So you push the pawn here and then push this other pawn here to build a very strong attack on the center, and specifically expanding on the queen side. As we'll see throughout this series, or throughout this video, in the King's Indian defense, white tries to get a strong attack and a strong space advantage on the queen side, whereas black tries to mount a strong attack on the king side. So there's this sort of lopsided attacking pattern that you see in this line. Bishop to g7, fianchettoing the bishop, and this is what I was talking about. That's extremely unintuitive. It looks like the black bishop, the dark squared bishop, is attacking the queen side, but actually, as we'll see, this bishop is going to end up attacking the king side. It's hard to see how that could possibly happen, but we're going to see that happen. So e3, black castles king side, bishop e2, d6, and the point of this move, as we'll see also in several of the other games, is that this knight is going to come here, and then this pawn is going to come up here. So this knight is effectively supporting the strike in the center, but still on the king side center strike. White castles king side. The knight comes out as planned, and knight c3, e5, b4. So this queenside attack is starting to shape up. White is reaching for extra space here on the queenside, and black advances the pawn. The knight moves out of the way, The rook comes to support it because now, as you can see, the pawn is being attacked twice. So by adding the rook, we now have two defenders on it. The bishop comes along to b2. The knight is going to be remaneuvered around to the king side. a4, continuing to expand on the queen side. h5, expanding on the king side. Queen b3, knight 8 to h7. Rook f to c1, bishop f5, a5, a6 to try to somehow blunt the advance of the a pawn, b5, c6, b takes c6, b takes c6, queen d1, knight g5, bishop f1 to kind of add a defender to this pawn here. This is a common theme that sometimes comes up in master games when they're trying to defend their castled king. They'll want to in this case, white is doing it, but often black does it as well to sort of tuck the bishop away for a future end game rather than having him be exposed to the rigors of the middle game. And he also serves a defensive role. Bishop to g4, attacking the queen. Queen to e1. Queen to d7. Bishop to a3, hitting the pawn here on d6. The rook comes around to support it. And c5, d5, rook c to b1. As we can see, white has this open file here, and they're going to try to invade along the file. So the name of the game here is going to be, can white mount a big attack on the queen side faster than black can attack the king? It's going to be like a race to see who can attack faster. Queen to f5, rook to b6. We can see clearly that both of these pawns are attacked. Protecting this pawn since it's the base of the pawn chain, but sacrificing the a6 pawn. Rook captures, and then the bishop comes around to h6, and it's still super hard to see how this bishop will ever play a role. Given that he's still sort of pointing over here. And I think this is a very interesting position to me because it's still not clear how black is going to be able to attack. I mean, black has a lot of pieces on the king side, but they're sort of disjointed. They're kind of all over the place, and they're stepping on each other's feet. Um, as we'll see, a very interesting idea in the King's Indian defense is that actually the king is going to move out of the way here, and the rook is going to come around behind it. It's a very interesting theme that seems to come up often in the King's Indian defense. The queen comes to b1 to take advantage of the open b file. Knight to e6, rook to a2, queen to g5, trying to arrange the pieces to form a coherent attack. Rook to b6, getting out of the way, and now we can see, getting out of the way of the pawn, and now we can see that white has a very concrete attack plan here. So this file is open, the pieces are doubled up. This rook can even come here, and then you have what's traditionally known as an Alechine's gun, which is a battery where the queen is in the back and the two rooks are in the front. Um, and this pawn is going to be a threat to promote. So very strong queenside attack by white. So we'll see if black can attack on the king side fast enough to counteract it. The bishop gets out of the way of the queen, bishop f5. The queen comes around to defend. The knight comes to hit the pawns here, and black has a concrete idea here, which is to shift the queen over to here and threaten checkmate. The knight comes around to defend, so basically white is starting to get worried about black's attack. The queen does the threat that we talked about a moment ago, which white protects or defends by advancing the pawn. And actually, incredibly, black decides to give up the knight to let this happen. And the idea is that what black wants to happen is for white to capture, and then black can capture back. And then eventually the king will come up, and the rook will come behind the queen. And once this mess of pieces figures out how to coordinate, there will be a very strong battery along the H file. So we'll see how that happens. So captures, and trying to kick the queen away with g3. The queen simply moves away, and attacking the knight with the f-pawn, which black captures en passant. And look at this beautiful pawn chain that's pointed at the king. If you've seen my channel, you know I also like to play Crazy House, and in Crazy House, you are able to put down pieces, and usually you want to put down pieces in a way that forms a pawn chain at the opponent's king. This doesn't usually, or I haven't seen it often happen in normal chess, but here black is succeeding at building a pawn chain at the opponent's king, and we can expect that to be very strong. So the knight comes to defend on f2. The king moves out of the way for the rook to come behind here along the h file. Bishop comes to a6, trying to continue with the queenside attack. The rook moves out of the way. Knight goes to f1, rook to h8 as planned. Bishop to b7, essentially allowing the bishop to control the promotion square here. And also the other thing that's happening here is that the bishop is lined up with the pawns, and hypothetically maybe could capture them if there was time. Bishop to h3, pushing the pawn to a6. And now the bishop, incredibly, we have this beautiful move where not only is there a pawn chain pointed at the enemy king, but now there's a bishop at the head of it, basically restricting the movement of the white king. a7, threatening promotion, and now we can see that black has to play a very forcing line, otherwise white will promote here. Queen to h1 check. This is an incredible queen sacrifice that is required to make this work. The knight captures on h1, and then knight to h3 check, king h2, bishop captures on h3, and now we can see that the previous two moves, basically the knight gets out of the way with check, of course, to allow the bishop to get out of the way so that the rook can finally come to bear down on the h file. And in this position, white resigned because it's mate in 3. And we can see that if we enable the engine, basically Stockfish gives the best line as queen takes e3, and then knight to g5 with check from the rook, king to g1, rook captures, king to f2, and then finally checkmate with rook captures f1. So let me go back to the actual game. So a very interesting game between Galliamova and Kashlinskaya, in which incredibly at the last moment the pieces on the king side, which looked very uncoordinated, were able to coordinate. And this bishop, which I kept being concerned with, which was pointed at the queen side, actually ends up coming here to eliminate this escape square. And as we'll see in some of the other games, this bishop often plays an even more active role than this. So very interesting game. Okay, so the next game that we're going to look at is a game from 1953 between Taimanov and Najdorf. And here, white opts for a more traditional move order for the King's Indian, in which it looks like it's coming out of the Queen's Gambit declined. It starts with d4. Black responds with knight f6, then c4. This is basically the setup that you would expect. If black had played d5, this would be sort of the Queen's Gambit, right? Sacrificing the c pawn. But instead, black plays the King's Indian defense g6. White responds with knight c3, bishop g7, again fianchettoing the bishop along this diagonal that looks like it's not going to be very impressive, but it's going to be very useful, surprisingly, to attack the king when it castles on the king side. e4, d6, knight f3, castle king side, bishop e2, e5, striking in the center. In the previous game, we saw the knight come out to d2, but in this game, Najdorf just goes ahead and strikes in the center. Castle kingside, knight c6, which is, yeah, it's not the same as last time when we had the knight on d2, but still. d5, knight to e7, knight to e1, knight to d7, bishop e3, f5, striking along the king side. And we're going to see again that black is going to eventually amass all of these pieces to attack on the king side. f3, f4. Again, we see this pawn chain aimed at the opponent's king. Not yet the king exactly, but clearly shaping up to a good attack. Bishop to f2, g5, knight d3, knight f6, c5, starting to try to attack the crazy pawn chain. Knight g6, rook c1, rook f7, rook c2, bishop f8, c takes d6, c takes d6. So white now has an open file here, which could potentially be a problem for black. As we've talked about, basically in the King's Indian defense, white tries to quickly mount an attack on the queen side, whereas black tries to mount an attack on the king side. And it just so happens that the king is on the king side. So that makes it such that the attack is high stakes. So queen d2, g4, and this is a very interesting move because it starts to bust open the position. It's a double-edged move for black, of course, because I mean the g pawn is of course one of the pawns that should be defending the castle for black, right? And it's all the way over there, so it's not fulfilling its defensive role. So black is hoping that their attack is going to be strong enough that they never have to defend. We'll see if that's the case. Rook f to c1, g3, h takes g3, f takes g3, bishop takes g3, knight to h5, bishop to h2, bishop to e7, knight to b1, bishop to d7. So the point of this move is that in the previous move, when white moves the bishop out of the way, we now have this rook battery lined up here. So what's going to happen is white can capture, and then when black recaptures, uh, um, well, actually, you could, yeah. So white can again recapture, and then basically the white's attack is running out of steam. Sorry, black's attack is running out of steam. So instead, what black does is move this bishop out of the way so that it basically adds a defender to that square. So now there's three defenders and only two attackers. And even if the queen were to somehow join in on the game, it's still just three attackers to three defenders. It's even, so it should be okay. So the queen goes to e1, bishop to g5. So the point of this little move sequence is that um, black was threatening to skewer the queen to the bishop, but by getting out of the way, white prevents that. So the queen gets out of the way, and the bishop still comes in to attack the rook. And now we can start to see this thing that I keep harping on, which is the bishop coming from the G7 square, where it doesn't look like it's going to be particularly useful for attacking the king, um, and he's going to start his maneuver, or since he's a bishop, you could say his pilgrimage, to be able to fulfill an active attacking role. Knight d2, bishop to e3 check, king to h1, queen to g5, adding more pieces to the attack. So we can see black has all of these pieces attacking, and even the bishop. So the only piece that's not, oh, also the queen, of course. The only piece that's not fulfilling an attacking role here on the king side is the rook. Whereas white's pieces are sort of doing two tasks. I mean, yes, the two rooks are doing a great job of bearing down on the c file. That's great. And the two knights are uh, I mean, they're on the queen side. I guess you could hypothetically say they're supporting the queen side attack, but not really. This bishop is hemmed in. This bishop is staring at this pawn chain. So I mean, it's fulfilling a defensive role for sure. So I would definitely say that this bishop is fulfilling a defensive role. But see, white is sort of splitting its pieces between uh, attacking and defending, whereas black's pieces are all just attacking, except for this rook, which is not doing anything. So bishop to f1, rook a to f8. So now all of black's pieces are actually attacking. Rook to d1, b5, um, and then a4. So I should say the point of this move, b5, is that white had a threat here, and that threat was to move the knight here. And what that does is it forks this bishop and this pawn. So if white were to successfully capture this pawn, then suddenly this bishop becomes a lot more active because this pawn is now not supported and it's actually attacked twice by the knight and by the bishop. And now white may actually be able to make some attacking progress. And on the other hand, it also attacks this bishop. If the knight had come here, it attacks this bishop. So that's two attacks, which is enough to actually take it out. Where black would not want to lose this bishop since it's such a beautiful attacking piece here. So so by playing b5, black prevents that. It essentially takes away this square from the knight. And I think this is a general strategic theme. You want to use your pawns. You don't want to advance your pawns too enthusiastically because, of course, they create weak squares. But you will a frequent purpose of making pawn moves is to take away squares from knights to prevent them from lodging into your position and doing nasty things. White plays a4 to try to dislodge this pawn and enable the knight to come down. Black protects it with a6. A takes b5, a takes b5, rook to c7, attacking this bishop. Rook to g7, knight to b3, knight to h4. So we start to see the pieces, as in the previous game, although there's a lot of pieces on the king side, they looked a little bit uncoordinated, but slowly you can see black is starting to actually successfully coordinate them. The queen and the rook are bearing down on this g-pawn. This knight is also now hitting the g-pawn. This other knight can potentially come around, and this bishop is also doing some nice attacking tasks. Rook to c2, exactly to protect this weak g pawn. Bishop to h3, queen to e2, and then knight captures, bishop captures with check, queen captures, and of course, black is not interested in trading queens in this position. Of course, when you're attacking, you want to avoid unnecessary trades. But white actually decides that it's in their best interest here to try to make some trades, even if they're not helpful trades. And so queen captures rook, king captures, the rook comes around with check, and then the king moves to h8, knight to e1, knight to f4, rook to g3, bishop f2, essentially double attacking the rook and the knight, rook to g4, queen to h3, knight to d2, h5, attacking the rook. And in this position, white resigned. And the reason that white resigned is because the next thing that black is going to do is going to come here to force a so basically, white is going to move their rook away to here, for example, and then black is going to come to g8 to force a trade. And now there's just not enough defenders. You have three attackers here. It's gonna be checkmate here pretty soon, and there's really only two defenders doing anything at all. And in fact, if we enable the engine, okay, so Stockfish actually tells us that it's mate in 7. Um, I think that's a bit much for humans to sort of calculate quickly, but it's sort of mate in 7, and we can play it out here. So rook moves away, bishop captures. Uh, there's a check, but it's really just one of these time wasting checks. It's not like there's actually anything to be done here, and white even has to turn in the rook. and then this is just a dumb move here, and then that's checkmate. Okay, so very nice game, where as before, we saw sort of the race to attack, white trying to attack on the queen side, black attacking on the king side, and at first, due to space constraints, it's just a mess of pieces. It's a cluster of pieces, and black has to eventually figure out a way to get them to coordinate into a nice, coherent attack. And that brings us to the third and final game of this video, which is Donovan versus Fischer from 1956. As I mentioned, Fischer was actually one of the main exponents of the Queen's Indian defense. He played it from some of his earliest tournament games and pretty much throughout his career. In fact, this game is from when he was 13 years old. It's a beautiful attacking game, and we're going to see it here. So d4, knight f6, c4. So as we saw before, this is the setup that you also sometimes see in the Queen's Gambit or the Queen's Gambit declined. Um, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, fianchettoing the bishop, and again going to perform this magic trick where it looks like this bishop has nothing to do with any kind of, it looks completely irrelevant to attacking on the king side, but there will still be a very interesting attack on the king side. e4, d6, knight to f3, castles king side, bishop to e2, knight b to d7. As we have seen in some of the previous games, the goal is to strike in the center here on the king side of the center, and this knight provides some nice support there. Castle's king side, e5, as planned. H3, that's not a very good move, to be honest. And what white is thinking here is that they want to prevent the knight from coming here, but that's actually not going to be relevant. Black is going to be able to maneuver the knight and still set up a pretty good attack. I mean, maybe, oh, sorry, let me delete that. I didn't mean to make that move. So, I mean, it looks like it constrains black a little bit, but not really. So c6, bishop to e3, queen to e7, queen c2, starting to try to create an attack on the queen side. So I found another game between Korchnoi and Fischer, in which Korchnoi actually, well, he created the most interesting example of this queenside attack that I was able to find while researching this video. He basically created a nice little raiding party around the queen. So the queen was somewhere out here, and then you had like a bishop over here, and then the two knights actually made it over here, and then even rooks. It was a very nice game, actually. But I decided not to show it in this video because in this series, what we're interested in is attacks on the kingside castle, and in that game, there was not. We're interested in attacks on the castle in general, not necessarily the kingside castle. And in that game, there was not a super strong attack on the castle. It was just sort of eventually the attacks canceled each other out, and then Fischer was able to win. So a6, a4, rook to e8, d takes e5, d takes e5, a5, knight to h5, and now we're starting to see this maneuver I talked about. Bishop f to d1, knight to f4, bishop to f1, as we saw in the Galliamova game, essentially protecting this pawn and tucking away the bishop to prevent it from the chaos of the middle game. Knight to f8, starting to maneuver the knight around. c5, knight 8 to e6, knight to a4, knight to g5. So now we have both of the knights basically bearing down on the king side. Knight takes g5, queen takes g5, king to h2, bishop to e6, g3, trying to relieve some of the pressure here, bishop to h6, and this is a very interesting move because Fischer essentially sacrifices the knight. He allows this capture to happen, and the queen will just sort of get out of the way, and the bishop is here sort of along the diagonal, staring down at the other bishop. G takes f4, e takes f4, bishop to c1, queen to h4, rook to a3, protecting this pawn here, which had a double attack from the queen, but actually basically overprotecting it because this other bishop also provided some defense. Uh, Rook A to D8, Rook A to D3, challenging this rook and creating a stare down along the D file. Rook takes D3, Rook takes D3, Bishop to G7, B3, F5, essentially creating a pawn storm. And this is one of the crazy things that we've seen throughout the King's Indian defense is that you push the pawns in front of your king. That seems like it should be a mistake, but it ends up working sometimes. I actually don't know what the win rate is in general, statistically speaking, but very often it ends up working. Rook to F3, F takes E4, Queen takes E4, Bishop to F7, Queen C2, Rook E1, Bishop to C4, basically pinning this bishop to this other bishop and trying to create space for white and also trying to defuse black's attack. So Queen to G5, allowing the trade. Bishop takes F7 check, King F8, but actually black doesn't trade because black doesn't want to allow white to get more tempo. So basically, if white captured, then black could get in some more attacks. For example, with queen to c4 check, and white would have some dynamism. A slightly better move for black, of course, would have been to just go into the corner, and it would be even less likely for there to be further checks. But I guess what Fischer was thinking was that would pin down, that would create the potential for white to pin that bishop and create another exchange with check. So probably that's why he decided to move his king to f8 instead. So rook to g3, f takes g3, f takes g3, queen takes c1, and at this point we can tell that Fischer has sort of given up on a checkmating attack, and instead he's just trying to simplify the position. So queen takes c1, rook takes c1, bishop to e6, and basically from this position, the black is going to win very easily because black has a bishop and a rook, and white has a bishop and a knight, and pawns are even. So black should be able to win very easily. So in this case, the attack on the king didn't lead to checkmate, but it did lead to material advantage. So if you're interested, we can show the rest of the game. Rook e1, bishop c8, basically attacking the base of these pawns here. Rook e2 check, king h1, and then rook e7, protecting the base of the pawn chain. King g2, king e8, h4, king d8, attacking the bishop, bishop g4, and then rook e3, and in this position, white resigned. And if we enable the engine here real quick, Stockfish prefers black by minus 4.6. At the master level, that's good enough to decide a game. So that's Donovan versus Fischer. So anyway, thank you for watching this video. As we saw today, the King's Indian defense often leads to very interesting attacks on the king side in ways that can be surprising. The bishop starts out fianchettoed here, pointing at the queen side. It doesn't look like anything. Doesn't look like anything interesting is going to happen, and yet somehow, very often, that bishop ends up on the king side, pointed in aggressive ways at the castled king. Very interesting things can happen with the rooks coming, for example, behind the king in this case. In the Taimanov versus Najdorf game, the rook actually came to the front. Very interesting sacrifices that can happen. In this game versus in Galliamova versus Kashlinskaya, we saw a knight sacrifice. Very strong pawn structures here along the center of the board, and very dynamic games in which white also has interesting queenside attacking ideas. The danger for white, as we saw, is that they can be caught sort of prioritizing two things: defending on the king side versus attacking on the queen side. Uh, which they have to defend basically because their king is on the king side where they're getting attacked, whereas black has a little bit of fewer concerns because the attack is on the queen side, their king is on the king side, and they're attacking on the king side, so all of their pieces can sort of stay on that side. So thank you for joining me on this video. I hope it was helpful for you. I recommend the King's Indian defense as an opening that naturally provides these kinds of very interesting middle game plans. If you struggle with composing an attack for the middle game, I recommend studying the King's Indian defense. It sort of comes with some nice attacking ideas. And please make sure to like and subscribe if you like this video. Thanks, and I will see you next time.